Great. Uh,
Ready?
we're recording for the Zoom as well, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Greetings, everyone. Welcome again to another Freedom Friday Forum. Coming to you from the Woodson Banneker Jackson Bay Division, UNIA ACL RC 2020, here in Washington, D.C. We have this forum twice a month, covering subject matters that are usually relevant to the issues confronting African people, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Tonight we have one of those issues. It's having to do with the Bethesda African Cemetery. And we have with us a panel of speakers, presenters, and we will discuss that issue, where we are at this time after the Maryland Appeals Court surprised us with a decision that now means we must continue the struggle to save Moses Cemetery. So as soon as I'm over with this ritual part of things, we'll get to that discussion. And I'll introduce the panelists and those of us who are on live stream. You will, I guess you'll be hearing from us. All right. We'll start with the official pledge to the flag, the UNIA flag. I commit my body, mind, and spirit to the protection, defense, and security of the red, black, and green. I dedicate my life to the redemption of Mother Africa and the liberation of her scattered Black children. I accept for myself and my descendants the teachings of universal African nationalism, and I promise that our children will be instilled with the purpose and knowledge of themselves as African people, in order that the cause of our struggle will neither falter nor fail, until all Black people are free and united through one God, one aim, one destiny. Yes, that's the pledge we make. The red, black, and green flag. Okay, but as usual, we also have to inform people, those who do not know as yet, and remind people, those who know, of what the purpose of the UNIA, how the Constitution was made up by our ancestors, and that preamble before everything else in it, what it says about how we should operate as a people and as a UNIA ACL. The Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League is a social, friendly, humanitarian, charitable, educational, institutional, constructive, and expansive society, and is founded by persons desiring to the utmost to work for the general uplift of the Negro peoples of the world. And the members pledge themselves to do all in their power to conserve the rights of their noble race and to respect the rights of all mankind, believing always in the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. The motto of the organization is one God, one aim, one destiny. Therefore, let justice be done to all mankind, realizing that if the strong oppresses the weak, confusion and discontent will ever mark the path of man. But with love, faith, and charity towards all, the reign of peace and plenty will be heralded into the world, and the generations of men shall be called blessed. And that's the preamble of the Constitution. our guiding force. So from that, let me again introduce myself. I am Baba Mosi Matsumo, President of the Woodson Banneker Jackson Bay Division, UNIAACL RC 2020. And with me as co-host is Baba Congo Africa, who is the Vice President of the division. I also have several members who are on this panel, but they are also with the BSCC, the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, of which we, of the UNIAACL-RC 2020, is a part. We have committed ourselves to work in solidarity with all the folks of the BSCC to bring a solution to this attempt to sell this parcel of land, or parcels of land, because it's been parceled out, at the Moses African Cemetery in Bethesda. It's a struggle. And with this panel, we shall tell you more about it. We have with us Reverend Segun Adebayo, who is the pastor of the church, the Macedonian Baptist Church in Bethesda. And he's the leading figure in the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition. We also have with us Reverend Juli, who is part and parcel of the BSCC. She is a fighter, strong in the struggle. And she has been with the UNIA for a short time, but it's one of our strong members. We have also Brother Paul Pumphrey, another outstanding member of the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, another fighter, another person who has been in the struggle for African freedom a long time. Now, he may look a little younger than he is, but he's been around for a little while. And Brother Robert Stubblefield, another fighter in the BSCC, Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition. I'm joining the BSCC with the UNIA. I've seen quite a few people, younger people who, when you get used to just seeing people of a certain age in the struggle, you tend to think that that's not all it is, and that there aren't too many people of the younger generations who are willing to get involved. And I don't know Brother Robert's age. He does look like he's about 29, but he could be a lot more than that. I'm not asking you to say how old you are, Brother Robert. And so those are the panelists we have on tonight. Missing is, the president of the BSCC, Dr. Marsha Adebayo. She has had a conflicting event, so she will not be on the panel. But with us also it's Mama Tendai, who is the Minister of Education of the UNIAACL RC 2020, and she's going to give her point of view, and that position in the UNIAACL is very important, being the person who is in charge of where education will be going in the UNIAACL RC 2020. So I'm going to now ask this panel to get ready to express to you what is going on right now. You know, it's so hard to understand, you know, after hearing about that shocking decision by the Maryland Appeals Court. It's like I don't know where to start. But I'll first ask the Reverend Segun to give us a little background of because you know he's a founder of the BAC. Just give us a little background of himself, the organization, the church, and then we'll move on to some of the other members of the panel. Reverend Segun?
Well, good evening to our president and to all my sisters and brothers on the platform and those on the live stream. I bring you fraternal greetings. So I'm here both as a member of BACC, the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, and also a member and the pastor of the Macedonia Baptist Church, the only remaining institution that reminds us that that stretch of River Road for many years was a Black community. I've been in Macedonia now for about 32, going 33 years. And for many of those years, we didn't even know there was a cemetery on the other side of the street from the church. We lived our life in blissful ignorance, I might say, because the older members of the church who actually lived on River Road, they were mum about the experiences. They never said a word about it. And the only way that we came to know about this, hallowed ground was, the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, which I will simply call the Planning Board or the Planning Commission, decided to move forward with a sector development plan for that, parts of Bethesda. It's called the West Bar sector. It was in that process that we came to know that there was a burial ground on the, west side of River Road from the church. And in digging through the history, then we found out that our church actually used to also be on that side of River Road, very near to the cemetery, back in those days. Towards this land, this part of Bethesda, we call it, gray land, because much of their property back in the, late 1900s was actually owned by a Black woman, Mrs. Gray. She bought much of that land, and she was the one that sold part of the land to the church, to lay its foundation on that side of River Road. I mean, to cut a long story short, despite the attempt of the planning board to hide the reality of the cemetery from the community, we thank God for a group that called Save West Bar that was fighting the development. It's through their lawsuit, through their discovery, that we came across emails that we found out that they were actually trying to hide the presence of the cemetery. And we thank God also for Brother Harvey Matthews, who is a trustee of Macedonia Baptist Church, a longtime member. I believe he's been a member of Macedonia now for upwards of 60-something years. And he was the one that testified before the planning board that this is not just an alleged cemetery. This was his playground, along with his brothers and sisters and friends and cousins, because, Black kids had nowhere to play but in the cemetery. And that's how we became engaged to say, well, there was a cemetery there. It's now been bulldozed. The headstones have since been removed. The land has been parceled up, parcel 175, 177, 240, 242, on and on. And the foundation of the Westwood Towers, which is owned by the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County HOC, sits upon, the burial ground. During the digging of the foundation of this building, we have oral history that tells us that in the process, they were finding human remains. Rather than them stopping and doing the right thing, they bulldozed those remains down the cliff and piled them up into a huge 60-feet deep ditch and covered it up with asphalt. And today now it's a parking lot for the Westwood Towers. So that's how we became engaged. And when we began, a few of us in the basement of our church, I thought this was going to be a simple matter. Based on where I came from Nigeria, burial grounds and resting place of our people was considered very, very sacred, very, very sacred, and it's treated with that measure of sanctity. And thought it was just once the information is known that the county would do the right thing, HOC would do the right thing, or the developer back then that was trying to, build, actually they were trying to build a parking garage on what is currently the parking lot so that they can put additional apartment units above the parking garage. But it's been a difficult struggle. Largely, I believe because these are Black people that are buried there. I totally convinced that if it was just a different race of people, there'll be more respect. There might be more respect. But I want to thank UNIA as a Black-owned and led organization for coming out to help us. I mean, you have been very instrumental in our struggle. Baba Senghor, Mama Ya, Baba Congo, Baba Zama, and a host of other members have joined us in the knowledge that these are our ancestors, not just ancestors of members of Macedonia Baptist Church. These are our ancestors that came out of Africa, kidnapped from their homes and brought in chain, to serve the cause of capital. And so we've been engaged in this struggle, both with the county government, both with the Parks and Planning Commission and with the HOC, and with other developers that came before HOC. But yet, they would not do the right thing. Up to the point that HOC, while at some point they were talking from both sides of their mouths, talking about negotiating with us as to how we can honor our ancestors. Our plan was to build a museum to tell the story of their struggle, of their resilience, of their resistance, and of their power, and also a memorial to commemorate their presence, to sanctify their hallowed ground. That was our goal, and this is still our goal. But it's been a hard struggle. And when HOC decided they were going to sell the land to a fourth developer, Chargers Venture, we went into action, protest in front of the so-called Chargers Ventures corporate office. Following years of protests at the HOC head office in Kensington, we marched on the streets, but yet the country refused to do the right thing. In fact, they call us troublemakers. And it's a badge of honor that we wear with pride. We are troublemakers. Troublemakers for justice, troublemakers for honor and dignity for ancestors. That's the least we can do for them, those who gave us life. And so we went to court to stop that proposed sale. We prevailed at the district court in a magnificent opinion. We prevailed, and the HOC appealed the decision to the Court of Special Appeals in Annapolis. The hearings were held back in October 2022. And I had confidence that based on my understanding of the law and just on the dignity of humanity, that the appeals court will uphold the decision of the lower court. Lo and behold, was I disappointed. We were all totally appalled. But I guess some said they were not surprised because this is just a continuation of the history of the relationship between our people and this nation, those in power, marauding capitals. That says nothing good in our people. We are less than human as far as they are concerned. So they ruled against our interest, basically saying that the interests of capital, of developers, supersedes the interests of the descendants to have access to the burial place of the ancestors. So that's where we are in a short, just a quick brief. It's a disappointing, appalling decision, racist in my view, but it's a continuation of our history. And we need to mobilize our community. Again, I'm so thankful for UNIA, because much of our communities is totally asleep. They seem to be comfortable with what is being done to the ancestors on River Road. I want to thank my co-members in BACC, those on the panel, Brother Paul, Sister Reverend Julian, my son in the struggle, Brother Robert, and of course my wife, and a host of others, multicultural, multi-generation, and multinational organizations that have come together to say, not on our watch. So we are still in the struggle. This is the eighth year that we have given to this struggle. I think they hope by now we will have vanished. But the more that they kick at us, the stronger we become, the more determined we have become. That will give our very breath, give our very time, and make this is essence of our life. And this is the hill, where we refuse to back down. So again, I thank UNIA, the membership, for all the support, down through the years. So I know that we can continue to count on the support you are giving us so that we can together, fight this evil of our time until justice is done and our ancestors are accorded the dignity that they deserve. Thank you, Brother President.
Thank you. Thank you, Rev. Segun, for that historical background. And now I'm going to go to someone who, having been raised in Montgomery County and having experienced Montgomery County's civic history, he can probably, no, I shouldn't say probably, you can give us some historical background of living, what you think has happened in Montgomery County, what you feel and what you feel about what Rev. Segun has said, and if you can add some more dealing with, the history of that HOC in Montgomery County. Brother Paul.
I want to thank you for the invitation to share some information. Starting off with the fact that, yes, I was born and raised in Montgomery County, and that was over 70 years ago. Give a little background of Montgomery County. Today's Montgomery County projects an image of a liberal county, a county that gets along with the different races from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, etc. But the reality is that Montgomery County as a government has had a strong alignment with corporations, whether those corporations were farms or whether those corporations in today's world were developers. I remember back in the 50s when, in fact, the public schools in Montgomery County were all segregated. We often got newspapers from the Washington Afro, and we would have case after case of African-American families losing their land from unscrupulous developers who would come in, give people play like they're friendly with the folks, knowing that many of these people never went beyond 6th grade. And often even took people and got them drunk and then had them put their X on a piece of paper, telling them it was for one thing, and actually that X meant that these people had accepted their land to be sold to them at way below market price. One thing that a lot of people that haven't been from this area are not aware of, that after World War II, the GI Bill provided free education for the soldiers that fought in World War II. And also the government gave privileges for hiring to veterans who came out of World War II. And so there were a number of people who began to move to Washington, D.C. because during the war, the federal government of the United States grew dramatically. So folks came here to go to school, folks came here to get government jobs. And as they moved into Washington, D.C., they began to build on what lots that were still vacant in the city, and it became very clear that the city itself would not handle the influx. At the same time, you had a situation happening in the South where you had mechanization of farms. And because of the racism in the South, a large number of African-American families moved north to the different cities looking for jobs. And often those jobs may have been housekeeping, it may have been working in a menial job for the federal government or the local governments. But those folks moved up to Washington, D.C. And you had developers who pretty much ran out of space of building more housing inside of Washington, D.C., who looked at different areas of Maryland and Virginia as the next frontier to make their profits off of. And so the move for them was to move and try to buy farms, which of course the real estate prices in Maryland and Virginia were much lower than the real estate prices in Washington, D.C., and then build houses, apartment buildings, etc. But one of the things that they decided to do was to use the area just north of Georgetown, which is now known as Chevy Chase and Bethesda, as the area in which the high-end real estate would be built. And so their move was to come in and to actually, as I saw it, because almost monthly you would hear read an article in the Washington Afro of how one family or another African-American family lost their land because some unscrupulous developer came in, sometimes even getting the person drunk, to get them to put the X on a piece of paper and then turn around and let them know a couple of weeks later that they had agreed to sell their property for way below a market value. And so you end up seeing a clearing of land, especially in the former African-American community that was north of Georgetown in Montgomery County, where people were swindled out of their land. And in fact, This is how Bethesda became about. This is how Chevy Chase became about, because this was all farmland. And in fact, you go further back, this land was also used by the plantation owners who had slaves, because Maryland being a slave state, that grew tobacco, that grew cotton on that land, and that a lot of the soil on that land went bad. And after the transatlantic slave trade was found illegal, they decided rather than raise crops, they would raise slaves. And so they did a project where they would actually take as young as 12-year-old girls to impregnate them to create a young slaves, or to have young African children that they could sell down to the South, the further South, for the people who still were expanding on their tobacco, they're expanding on their cotton, and they needed more manual labor. And so you had places like in the Bethesda area where those farms were producing children from children, as well as adults. And of course, in the process of doing that, a number of the young girls became ill and passed away, and they were just taken across the street and buried in the swamp area across from River Road. Now, this is what led to the graveyard itself. And this is one of the reasons why the coalition calls it the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, because in fact, many of the people that were buried in that property were people who were former slaves, African slaves, often young girls who died in their pregnancy, as well as stillbirths, were just taken across the street from the plantation and put into the ground. Later on, the Black community that came in after the Emancipation Proclamation, they began to use the adjacent land to bury members of their family as they became ill or passed away. But this is the kind of the background history, is that you have Montgomery County that really focuses on corporate greed, often at the expense of people of color. But the image they want to put out is something totally different. Like I said, I went to segregated schools all through elementary school. And when they began to integrate the schools, the way they did it was close all of the African-American schools in Montgomery County, even though some of those schools were newer built than the white adjacent schools that may have been a couple miles away, and forced the African-American students to go to historical white schools. And of course, when we went to our schools in Montgomery County, we were taught about our history, the history of Africans in the United States. But when we went to these historical white schools that didn't teach that, unless you had an African-American school teacher, you didn't get that information. And so you could see a whole shift in how younger people, younger than I was, that started the public school system after integration, actually have totally different understanding of their background and their history and their place in history. And so with this, I'm just going to wind up my presentation, but to really mention the fact that Montgomery County has not been the kind of county that a lot of people talk about. And I'm gonna give you one last example. In the community I grew up in, there was a developer that bought up about 15 acres of land. And on that 15 acres of land, he put about 35 or 40 houses, in which the lots that the houses were on was like on a quarter of an acre. And these were houses that had 4 bedrooms to them. They were very large houses. But the county planning board gave the developer the right to jam all those houses in that little bit of land. And that land ran up to a stream. And on the other side of the stream was an African-American woman who owned 5 acres of land. She had 4 children. And as their children got married, she decided to subdivide her 5 acres so that she would have an acre and each of her children would have an acre into 5 lots. The county planning board denied her right to subdivide her land. And it took our community to get organized and go to Rockville and complain about the unfairness of them allowing developers to put 4-bedroom houses on a quarter of an acre and not allow this African-American woman to put a single-family house per acre on her land. And they finally backed down after the pressure was built against the politicians that came up with that decision. And that's just one good example of how Montgomery County historically has not been fair and just in how they handle land, especially dealing with people of African descent. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Paul. That's very interesting history there. We have to get over our period of time here. It's at least until 8:40. So let's try and move along as quickly as we can. Brother Robert, I'm going to come to you so that you can give me your perspective on where we are at this point and your perspective of the politics of Montgomery County affecting the decisions of the HOC.
Okay, great. Thank you, Baba Mosey. First things first, let me just give thanks to the UNIA for hosting this Freedom Friday Forum. It's definitely very apropos. And thanks so much for Segun and Brother Paul Pumphrey for their perspectives, in terms of the history of the struggle for Moses Cemetery, and Brother Paul Pumphrey, his experiences growing up in Montgomery County. For myself, I spent most of my childhood in Montgomery County as well, and I can tell you, I can verify everything Brother Paul Pumphrey has said in terms of the fact that Montgomery County likes to project an image of a diverse county, a liberal county that gets along with everybody. But the problem with diversity is that diversity without equity, without inclusion, without justice doesn't mean anything. If anything, that diversity is used as an excuse to just give more people to oppress. And Montgomery County is nothing different. It's nothing different. During my time in the school systems, and I can tell you from my experiences, I went to schools that were hyper segregated, underfunded, and these were a majority of places where a majority of people were of color, specifically Black people. Meanwhile, you go across the county into the Bethesdas, the Potomacs, the Chevy Chases. Not only are these schools look brand new, but the houses are a lot better, and those places are overly resourced. And they're overly resourced in the following ways: easier access to mental health help. You don't really get to see the level of policing that you see in places where I grew up in Montgomery County, like East County. You go to Bricks Cheney, you go to White Oak, you see nothing but police cars every hour on the hour. And why is that? It is because the politics of Montgomery County have determined that the Black areas are the areas we're going to drain the most out of, under-resourced, and yet we're going to over-resource the Bethesdas, the Potomacs, and the Chevy Chases. This right here is what I like to call being blacked out by a whitewash. Because on the one hand is that whenever they do talk about Black history in Montgomery County, they hype up the Sandy Spring area. But what they don't tell you about the Sandy Spring area is that during the period of enslavement, was that due to the influence of the Quakers, Sandy Spring was what was called an emancipated zone. What that basically means is as long as you were in Sandy Spring, you didn't have to worry about the risk of being enslavement. But the minute you stepped outside of Sandy Spring, you were risk of being stolen and sold anywhere from Rockville to Bethesda on River Road to Gaithersburg to Germantown. That's what they don't tell you. And so how these influences play a role in Montgomery County politics is just that it is basically the politics of the Old South. They just learned how to disguise their stuff better. Now, how do they do that? For instance, they will throw a few crumbs. They will host a couple of events highlighting so-called civil rights heroes. But what they don't tell you is that how some of these civil rights heroes have basically essentially sold out to the status quo. They don't want to deal with Black revolutionaries like the Paul Pumpphreys, like the Segun Adebayos, like the Marsha Colemans, like the Juli Robertsons, or the Baba Moseys. You know why? Because revolutionaries raise a fuckus. Revolutionaries demand real, actual change. This is where we got to this point. When we filed our lawsuit against HOC in 2021, HOC first tried to deny that BACC had a claim. They said Macedonia Baptist Church didn't have a claim, even though the cemetery is named Moses Macedonia African Cemetery. And the fact that, too, you have at least that we know of 40 members of Macedonia Baptist Church that were buried in Moses Macedonia African Cemetery. And so the circuit court ruled in our favor, and Judge Carla Smith, in her decision, she said, because part of HOC's argument was, well, this is going to mess up affordable housing. In her response, she said, if this really was about affordable housing, there are other places in Montgomery County that HOC could build on and get more better market rate value, not on a, and this are her words, not near a cemetery at its surviving lands. Then HOC, also during that court case, HOC perjured themselves by saying they never acknowledged it as a cemetery, even though we have them on record acknowledging that that was a cemetery. And any judge in the Court of Appeals with any common sense would have looked at the fact that HOC perjured themselves and said, I'm not hearing your case. You lied to my colleague on the lower court, so how would I know that you're telling me the truth now? But instead, the Court of Appeals agreed to hear the case because the HOC changed their argument because of the word the court may versus the court shall.
No.
Despite the fact that there are other ways that when court may, and our attorney, to his credit, brought out the words that may does mean shall, especially when it comes to burial properties, because there's over 200 years of jurisprudence. That basically, when you bury someone in a piece of land, that remains a cemetery. Whether or not it is in use is irrelevant. Once you bury people there, it remains burial property. And so in the Court of Appeals' decision, they said that they acknowledge that BACC is the primary descendant community. They acknowledge the fact that there is a burial ground. They even acknowledge how that burial ground was lost due to the displacement of the African-American community that used to live on River Road. They acknowledge all of that. But they basically then turn around and say, in this particular case, economic development, affordable housing trumps the rights of a cemetery. And at the end of their decision, they try to assuage their conscience by citing a jurist who said that I weep for those who have family in the cemetery, but the law is clear. But that court case that they cited was cited 10 years before Dred Scott, and it was describing a case where a church was trying to sell a cemetery because that church, a white church, mind you, was particularly bankrupt. Goes back to the basic fundamental question: are Black people human? And are Black people, do they have rights in death as well as in life? Now, of course, our attorneys are going to file an appeal to the Maryland Supreme Court, but there are so many things that we must do now. One thing that we must do, and I encourage anybody who is listening via the live stream, is that you must seriously understand the ramifications of that court decision. The Court of Appeals basically said that it is open season on Black cemeteries. And first it came for Black cemeteries, and I'm telling you now, Black people, we are the canary in the coal mine. Anything that happens to us first, it then affects other groups. So you better get involved now. You better nip this in the bud now. How do you do that? You join a liberation movement. And that's what BACC is. Now, what is a liberation movement exactly? Well, to quote the freedom fighter, the philosopher, and I would dare say, and I would dare argue with anybody, the prophet Amilcar Cabral once noted, that when a liberation movement is in power, it is only when they can do battle with the forces of domestic imperialism and domestic colonialism. It affects Moses Cemetery because it is the worst kept secret in Montgomery County politics, that developers run Montgomery County. They have turned Montgomery County into their own personal fiefdom. And they have been pressuring every county official, from the county council to the county executive's office, HOC, the planning board, and the state delegation, that you cannot return that land to BACC, because if you do, then every other community will demand the return of their land, to which we say, so what?
What? Right.
We have the right to self-determination. We have the right to determine what is best for our communities. And all we are asking is for the return of that land so we can have a proper museum and a sacred space to tell the truth of what happened on River Road, and to make sure that what happened on River Road never happens again, and the words never again truly mean never again. The second part of this battle, in terms of joining the liberation movement, is that this also joins the battle for reparations. Everything Paul Pumphrey said about land being stolen, whether it's on River Road, Sandy Spring, Brownstown, and Germantown, calls for reparations. And I am pleased to announce that on Juneteenth, the BACC announced and debuted the Reparation Study and Action Plan for Montgomery County. You cannot, and Montgomery County does do it, and let me tell you why. Because back in December of 2019, before COVID, Montgomery County passed the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act. I want you all to hear that very clearly. The Racial Equity and Social Justice Act, Montgomery County passed that in December of 2019. It is the law of the land. However, you cannot talk racial equity without talking reparations. It is symbol without substance. And reparations is more than just cash payments. It is the total transformation, the systemic redistribution of the wealth and resources. It is return of any Black land that is stolen. And Montgomery County has acknowledged where Black land has been stolen throughout this county. And so I implore anybody who is listening, will come back and do battle in the streets with us, to sign on to the Reparation Study and Action Plan, either as an organization or as an individual. Host education programs about this, and more importantly, sign on to a letter of support condemning the Court of Appeals decision and standing in solidarity with the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition. And on that note, Baba Mosey, I yield the floor back to you. I yield the remainder of my time, where it's left, to Reverend Dr. Julianne.
You're muted, Baba Mosi. Baba Mosi, you are muted. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm
Okay.
sorry. Oh, my goodness. Robert, I said some nice things about you, but I can't repeat because old people, we don't remember what we said 5 minutes ago. So.
Only a few of them were true, right?
But anyway, I always admire your passion, Brother Robert, and you didn't let me down there when you give your presentation. And now let me go to Reverend Julianne Robertson, who she is an attorney as well, and I'm going to ask her to give her perspective about this decision, her perspective about the history, her perspective where we can be going as an organization, and that's the UNIACL, but with people, the BACC as well, to rectify the situation, this decision by the appeals court. Your perspective.
Well, I want to just start by giving thanks to UNIA. Thank you, Baba Mosi, for inviting me. Baba Segun, you changed my life. Thank you so very much. You and Marsha just have given me opportunities to do the work I'm born to do, and I'm so very grateful. I also want to express deep pride in Dr. Robert Stubblefield, because his scholarship, his delivery, his insight is so valuable. And I believe that you're going to be a national global leader in your own right, because your ability to work with the anthropology, the archaeology, the law, and the social and cultural impact of this issue is unparalleled. And I just want to say that publicly so that everybody understands. So I want to approach this issue from a political and cultural perspective. Everybody has already covered the fact that the Maryland Court of Appeals found the most narrow angle to overturn the TRO. And by doing that, they have called into question the existence of the right to the sanctity of our sacred burial places. And it's up to us to build and develop the coalition in a way that ensures success, but also highlights our solidarity. And we have a long way to go to get there. So we had a interfaith service a few weeks ago where we called on clergy from different areas of religion. We had a rabbi, we had a few Christian ministers. We hope in the future to get Buddhists and Hindus and Jainism, people who practice Jainism or Baha'ism, because the issue at hand arises from a place of savage racist violence. When you have the nerve to roll dump trucks and cranes and excavating material into a cemetery, and you know good and well that it's a cemetery. The county executive, Mark Elrich, made a big deal for quite a few years that it really isn't a cemetery, and BACC is telling a falsehood, and those people. Well, if you can do that, you can roll out police and shoot unarmed citizens. If you can do that, then you can have guns and tanks roll through urban areas and kill scads of unarmed people. What we're facing right now is genocide. Nobody likes to hear that word. Nobody wants to speak that word, but we're facing a kind of onslaught of violence that hasn't been seen since Nazi Germany. So let's be honest about what that means. Ultimately, if we don't organize and organize along the lines of self-defense, creating our own schools, creating our own food production, creating our own learning environments, not just schools, but spiritual and cultural learning, then we will be at the disposal, we'll be at the behest of people who intend to eradicate us from the earth. It sounds extreme, but it's also true. And so, again, we call on all of the faith traditions. We call on every single denomination within the Christian realm. I call on my friend, Dr. Bill Lamar at Metropolitan AME Church. I call on Reverend Dr. Michael E. Bell at Allen Chapel AME Church. I call on the AME Church itself, because the AME Church starts with the word African. So if we're going to call ourselves African, we better be African. If we're going to call ourselves African, we better preserve our cultural and spiritual heritage. We have to go all the way back to Igbo land and understand the cosmology of what it means to be African in connection with the Most High. You know, we seem to want to pretend that Olodumare isn't God, but of course he is. We want to talk about Obatala. We want to talk about Yemaya, Oshun, Ogun, Shango, Oya, and all of the deities who are our African heritage. When people were stolen from the west coast of Africa, they had their own tradition. And those traditions were later adapted and reinterpreted and misinterpreted and colorized or decolorized, so that they have convinced us that our belief system is not the one true religion, but it is. And so as we re-invoke and re-examine those traditions, we understand our humanity in a very, very different way. And I say all this to say that the cemetery may be excavated down to the bedrock, but the souls are still there. The soul is eternal. And so when we had the interfaith ceremony a few weeks ago, Baba Joseph Noah did a drum ceremony. And when he talked to me after the fact, he said very clearly, the developers have no idea what they have done. They have desecrated a space so sacred, not just because our people are buried there, but because of the violence that they face. If anybody on the planet ever deserved to have a peaceful rest, a sacred slumber, those people in that cemetery did. And so by tearing them out of the ground, and BACC has thousands of pictures of cranes that are digging biomass out of the ground, people whose ribs and whose shoes and whose funereal sacred objects are being handled by people who just want to sell them for money. Money is the least of the issues that are involved here, but that money is the only thing that matters to them. And so as we call our ancestors, as we call our allies, and speaking of allies, a few months ago, I think it was last September, there was a rally in Meridian Hill Park, Malcolm X Park, where very notable people, very powerful people who sacrificed everything for the movement spoke, and they talked about their experiences trying to liberate our people. But at the same time that we were in the park listening to these speeches and talking to each other and aligning together, there were 3 or 4 other rallies taking place across the city. Now, what would have happened if everybody participating in those other rallies came together? That's what it's going to take. We've got political prisoners who are still incarcerated. We have Imam Jamil in a prison in Atlanta, H. Rap Brown. We have dozens of people who otherwise would have been our thought leaders who are behind bars, and we've forgotten them. Last week, I was, upset on the impending passing of Dr. Shakur. It's very painful to understand that he suffered. He gave everything for us. And instead of continuing pressure on the system to release him years ago, he should never have, how many bond hearings did he have? So instead of, letting him suffer, we bought our Teslas and we bought our Mercedes and we're running in, the clothing and the jewelry and everything. And that's nice, but it doesn't do anything to liberate our people. It's very nice, but it doesn't get us into the mindset of alignment so that we're able to bring together thought leaders from different organizations. It's not about competition, it's about collaboration. And I want to call on the women, the mothers who have to prepare their children for a very different world than what we had. The Supreme Court decisions that have been coming down over the past few weeks and that will come down over the next few months are going to decimate our free access or our fair access to educational institutions. So what are we going to do about it? We cannot sit back and say, oh, well, the Supreme Court, they're the power. No, we're the power. We are the power. And the power of our love for one another is the thing that is going to spur our creativity. And I also want to give thanks to my friend and my mentor, Dr. Mink, because without you, this mindset probably would not have developed in the same way. So I just want you to know I love you and I thank you for everything that you've given to me. We're in a place where they're shooting our children in the street. And I have 2 sons. And I'm not in a space of terror, but I pray covering over my children every single day. And I think that that has to be a collective resolve for us to be as spiritual as we can be, but also to be as politically astute and politically active as we possibly can. We need to be marching on the Justice Department every single day, even if it's just one person with a sign, because they have to understand that we see what's happening. They are unfolding their final solution. And so at a time when they have the nerve to dig up our ancestors, it is an obscene desecration of the memory of people who built this entire empire. And so if we have to, I want to choose my words carefully, but I also want to be truthful. So if we have to dismantle this empire for them to get the point that we are the first people on this planet and we deserve the utmost respect. And I want to just thank Baba Segun for talking about the children who were defiled and thrown into a mass grave starting in 1807 when the transatlantic slave trade ended. So here we are. They believe that they can get away with taking our people out of the ground and throwing them away. Well, I want to give notice to Mark Elrich and the other individuals in county government who have seen fit to authorize this desecration. It's not going to end here. They have bones of human people, people who lived and contributed and had a future that was stolen from them. They have 200 parcels of bones hidden away in Virginia, far-fetched place, far-flung places in Maryland and other locations in the region. We want those bones back. We demand to have those bones so that they can have an honorable burial. And so I want to leave it there because I don't want to take too much time. Part of our job right now is to hold the energy of unconditional love and outrage and righteous indignation in the same sacred challenge, so that we are spurned to further action, but that when we take that action, it is done with ethics, morality, and integrity. And that's our mission right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julie. That was fantastic. I mean, again, you know, said with, you know, it was quite emotive in the way it went through, and I'm feeling it, and I hope everyone else is. Now, we just have 15 minutes, or maybe less than that, to cover the rest of what we'll do with this program. And I'm not going to talk much. I'm just going to, if there are any questions, I'm going to let those questions come through from anyone who has questions. But wait a second. I should, you know, I think, you know, Mama Tendai might. Mama Tendai, are you with us?
Yes, Baba, I'm here. I was just eating, so I didn't.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, All right. Caught you at a bad moment, but, okay. So, does anyone else, does anyone else have a question? For the panel? Okay, well, Brother Julius, I saw you on.
Am I live?
You are live, sir.
You're live. I think it's we're dealing with power. And power versus spiritual identity. We realized that Montgomery County was taken over as the financial capital of Maryland from Baltimore, when the finance capital moved from Baltimore to Montgomery County. And it established a regime to keep them in power across the entire state and on the East Coast. That's really the force that we're fighting against. The courts are only an intercessionary force right now. And mass action has to have power to overcome that. So that's what organization like UNIA and other organizations have to be able to come together and with people power, and be able to stand in the way of the bulldozers, as they say, and continuously do that. And we're not even discussing the millions of African indigenous that were buried there that we don't even talk about. Because that was indigenous land before it was ever Maryland. And millions of indigenous people that they want to not say were African are buried all over Montgomery County. So let's not leave it just in the Africans, quote, community that we say those are the people whose graves are desecrated, but it goes back thousands of years in that area. I've dug up areas building houses in Montgomery County. And about 10 to 15 feet down, you start running into everything that people used to own, used to have in their lives. How we amass that power is through the unity of our organization and our ability to identify an ideology and a means and ways that we maintain that power. And it takes more than the power of Maryland, it takes the power of all the people, the entirety of the UNIA, the entirety of African people standing up for themselves across this country, across Central and South America, and as I say today, all the way down to Volga Wharf in Rio de Janeiro. Because even though slavery may have been ended legally in 1807, the Baltimore merchants and the Maryland merchants moved slavery to Rio de Janeiro. And we have the largest number of slave trips back and forth from Rio de Janeiro to West Africa and Angola and Mozambique. So the transition of finance capital from Baltimore to Rio de Janeiro maintained slavery until the 1920s. I'll leave it at that.
You know, brother Julius, you know, thanks for that. And that's why I said a liberation movement has to be empowered, you know, with quoting Amilcar Cabral, you know, because liberation movements have to come together. And that's something that BACC we've been doing recently with a couple of other organizations who have now realized that a lot of things that we've been saying were very, not just prophetic, but came true. So now a lot of these organizations are now starting to come under BACC's banner in terms of how do we unite our struggles. And in terms of the recognizing the indigenous, you know, portion of this land, we recognize that the land that we are on is stolen Piscataway land, and specifically talking about Bethesda in particular. You know, that was the traditional trading grounds of the Nacotchtank, or as we know them as the Anacostans. It's from their name that's where we get the word Anacostia from. And so one of the things that we have to do now is that when the liberation movement comes in power in Montgomery County, is that we must use that as a model and as an example for other communities across the country. You know, because when the liberation movement is in power, desecration doesn't happen. Anyone who even thinks about desecrating a grave site gets penalized to the highest degree. When the liberation is in power, there is no such thing as food insecurity. There's only food oases. When the liberation movement is in power, you have economic democracy in the form of cooperative economics. When a liberation movement is in power, when you don't have to worry about pay equity because women already hold up the other half of the sky as an established fact, and that people are getting not a colonized education, they're getting a liberation education, an education that creates a school to prosperity pipeline, not a school to prison. In fact, the school to prison pipeline wouldn't even exist when the liberation movement is in power. And so that is what we have to do. But at the same time, the ultimate goal of the liberation movement isn't just liberation. It is democracy building. It is nation building. Every time when you look at the Amilcar Cabrals, the Thomas Sankaras, and even if you look here in the United States, Republic of New Africa, with things that people like the Mutulu Shakur and Daruba Ben Wahad were trying to do, it is very imperative that we also protect ourselves, you know, from, as Amilcar Cabral called, the cancer of betrayal. So that's the same thing. So I definitely agree with that. The other thing I do want to add, this is a battle cry that we have regarding not just Moses Cemetery, but it's pretty much goes destroyed today, returned tomorrow. And it is very impactful that we all remember stuff like that. That most of it may be you may destroy it today, but it shall be returned to the descendant community tomorrow.
Brother Robert, I don't know how you knew that I was coming to you next. But
Well, brother
that was a very good. All right, now I have to add to the fact that you can read minds. But anyway, that was very. I thank you for that. But also, I was going to ask you to make mention of the fact that this can affect a lot of the people around the country. This decision regarding the struggle to stop this kind of land theft that goes on when it comes to African cemetery, and what you have been doing in a sense of organizing.
Okay, absolutely, absolutely.
We got 3 minutes. Let's see if we can.
I'll try my best. So
Okay.
basically, you're absolutely right. The ramifications are basically that it is open season on Black cemeteries across the country. We're already seeing how in other places such as Texas and Florida, that some Black cemeteries are already being sold to developers to develop airports or building on hotels or even just building some affordable housing. But what we have been doing in the meantime is that we have been putting together an emergency descendants conference. This emergency descendants conference will be held next Saturday, July 22nd via Zoom. We are having descendants from across the country to come on. We're basically going to organize basically around like not only just the history, but the ramifications of this decision, but coming up with a solidarity statement and ways for us to better network with each other. You know, in terms of, because what happens in Mississippi and in Louisiana and Texas is going to have an impact here in Maryland and vice versa. As I think Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture once said, in order to understand Mississippi, you have to understand the Congo, because the same thing is happening here. The desecration of Black cemeteries is happening in the Caribbean, it's happening in Africa. And so we must be, so this Descendants Conference is for us to really be more proactive and being able for us to combat this atrocity, if you will.
Thank you, Brother Robert, and there again, that will be the last word. And I must thank the panel, Reverend Segun. Thank you very much for being here with us. It's been a pleasure. Brother Paul, thank you. Reverend Juli, thank you very much. Am I missing somebody? Oh, okay. You were saying something, Brother Julius, but you're muted, and we have to close because oh, pardon?
What Brother Robert was saying was so important to remember. This is primary. This is Piscataway land. It's Piscataway land that was stolen, robbed, murdered, executed. and then colonized.
Mhm.
And we're trying to retrieve the history of the colonization? Or are we trying to retain the sovereignty of the land and the sovereignty of the people?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Julius. I'll make that the last word. Again. Okay, again, folks, this has been a great presentation coming from the panel. And you know, I'm really glad that we've had this evening, because this decision is one that it's vile. I mean, it's a lawful thing in the what is vile, as far as I'm concerned. It's a vile decision, and you know, we have to continue to struggle to make this decision look like it wasn't real. So okay, again, it's 8:45. We must leave at this point, and thank you. Until next time, this is Baba Mosi Matsimula, and we're saying goodbye again. All right.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you to those folks who are on